playing some Dark Souls 2, surprisingly, which that game never gets old, man. I love
Oh
that
yeah.
game. Seriously, it's the only Dark Souls game that I'll go back to anytime and have a blast. Dark Souls 1, I've played it to death. I know that game inside and out, but if I go back to it, it's like I might as well just be watching a movie I've seen 100 times. You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
there's really nothing there for me. It's like it's enjoyable, kind of, but there's nothing that's gonna surprise me. There's nothing I haven't done, whether it's PvP or PvE. I've seen it all. I'm done with it, you know? Dark Souls 2, there's something about like the adventure and all the levels you go through and even like the easy bosses. Like I like easy bosses sometimes, you know? They're fun. That's something that I feel like is not necessarily missing in Elden Ring, but we'll get to that later.
What I wanted to add about Dark Souls
Mhm.
2, my a playthrough that I most recently have done. I haven't finished a playthrough. It's just what where I'm currently at,
Yeah.
and I've been exploring around with no rolling, which is something I started doing with Elden Ring on my first playthrough. It's just a lot of the bosses that were, of course, a little bit too, simplistic in design. I wanted to spend more time with them and see their movesets.
Yeah.
And so after doing that in Elden Ring, I went to Dark Souls 2. And I was like, you know what? I mean, why don't I just do the same thing here? I understand that the hitboxes are a bit weird, but I'll adapt to them. Um, and so when I applied no rolling to Dark Souls 2, I found that I enjoyed the boss fights immensely more, and
Oh,
actually
yeah.
brought back that heartbeat that I love when I defeat a boss. I'm like, man, I don't think I've ever had this with Dark Souls 2. And so, you know, it's weird that whenever someone's like, "Oh yeah, Dark Souls 2 just has easy bosses," I'm like, "Well, have you tried not rolling?" I know it sounds weird, but it works. I don't know how well it works for most of them. I understand that some bosses are like, I don't know about that, but
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
majority of the Dark Souls vanilla bosses, applying no rolling is, I find it extremely viable. Especially, I think my favorite one was the Mirror Knight. I spent so much time on that one, but I found that the most satisfying. Just
Yeah, I love the Midnight.
it's incredible what you can find with no rolling, and I feel like
Mhm.
the Mirror Knight, it's almost like it feels almost intentional that you can get away with it, but obviously it just wasn't designed that way. But for some reason, you
That's
can.
intentional.
Oh, you think it's intentional?
Mhm. You go through every boss in Dark Souls and you look at how every attack is mechanically, how they're timed, the tracking, and all these things. They're not accidentally done, right? Every attack has its own tracking, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Vertical, like stabs and slams, right? They typically have less tracking, right? Because it's a forward singular attack. And it's meant to get you for like rolling away or running away, right? Or just being too far away in general. As to where a horizontal sweep generally doesn't track too much either because it's just getting that broad, swath in front of it. And if you're behind bosses in most, Dark Souls encounters, they'll have an attack that's specifically made for when you're behind them, right?
Mm-hmm.
To get you away. And that's how they're designed, where it's more about positioning than it is just rolling, right? Which is why no roll works so well for those games, is because it was an intentional design to make sure that your positioning mattered and not just your timing, right? As to where with Elden Ring, that's completely flipped, and they track you 360, right? Doesn't matter where you are. They'll completely turn around and whack you, and that was in Dark Souls 3 as well, but not as bad. They still had balance, and you could tell that when they did do that, it was mostly for like, PvP related stuff, humanoid attacks, and where the attacks were important, they made sure that the tracking was good. And in Elden Ring, you get a little bit of that for the most part, though. It's a dodging, simulator. Dodge, 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 or jump. And that's fine. But getting back to Dark Souls 2, like you said, no roll does help the experience. It adds depth. I did a lot of that in Elden Ring with like some of the early bosses.
Mm-hmm.
It took super simple, boring bosses, and it just opened up a whole world of depth to
Oh
where they
yes.
become some of my favorite bosses,
Mm-hmm.
seriously, by far. And then you find the ones where you can't no roll them without having to abuse a mechanic or cheat it,
Yeah.
such as like unlocking them with the weapon art, which technically you shouldn't have to use a weapon art in no roll, right?
Right.
So I don't think that those are technically no rollable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And going back to Dark Souls 2 though, while it's a nice way to kind of experience those bosses, you don't even have to go that far. I mean, I guess this is going farther in some ways, but less in others. Uh, Level 1 in Dark Souls 2 isn't that hard either, right? They give you life gems, all these bright bugs and stuff, and things that'll just make you really strong, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's still difficult, but it's not like Dark Souls 3 difficult. However, they give you the COC Covenant, right? Which makes everything about twice as strong, and it makes enemies respawn indefinitely. And that's where you get like the real Dark Souls experience, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
That's supposed to be like the classic Dark Souls 1 experience in Dark Souls 2, which was actually tamed down to make it more of an accessible game, despite there being things like adaptability and stuff, which required adapting to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the Company of Champions alone made the experience infinitely better. Doing that as a level 1, every single boss, you got to experience them, you know? It's not like you just get to melt them real quick and it's over. Unless you specifically tailor yourself to be as damaging as possible. But that's something I've done in Dark Souls is not just going in there and seeing, okay, can I kill a boss at level 1? Because if that was the extent of the challenge, I just use the strongest spells and stuff and go in there with everything I could to guarantee my success. But that's not really what makes a fight fun for me. It's the actual choreography of the fight itself. And I don't always put a lot of time into it. It depends on how much I like a boss. But,
Right. Well.
when you go into a boss fight and you realize that you're too strong and you're going to kill it too fast, I let myself die because
Yeah.
I'm going to get a very unsatisfying fight where you'd watch it and go, well, that was over fast. What was the point? Why did you do this?
Mm-hmm.
What does it prove? Nothing. And it's not even about proving anything. It's just it feels meaningless, right? So
Yeah.
what do? I scale myself down even further. If level one's not enough, I'll use a weaker weapon or something that's at least fun, right? And I'll try to find like cool punishes for moves or something that just makes it seem more engaging and more like a fight. And that makes the games more fun. In Dark Souls 2, you can do a lot of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, you might be used to cheesing a boss and going around a corner, waiting for an attack and doing something, whatever. Like if you engage with the boss and engage with all the mechanics, they're a lot more fun than people give them credit for. There's a lot of ways to cheese Dark Souls 2, and a lot of people take advantage of that. But if you don't, and you really give it your all and do it, especially as a level 1 where you have low adaptability and you have to roll perfectly, it gets really deep and it's consistent too.
Yes.
More consistent than Dark Souls 3, despite it having tighter iframes. Especially with Color of the First Sin, where you get like really good frame rate. But
What's really sad going to the what I feel is the exaggerated hate about Dark Souls 2 is whenever I ask someone to explain a criticism about Dark Souls 2 is always very shallow. It doesn't really feel like
yeah,
it has any depth to it. And so
yeah,
when
it
I
does.
ask them, can they explain further? Usually they just link me to a YouTube video.
Yep.
I'm
I've
like,
seen good.
huh?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm just saying, how come whenever someone just has a very shallow opinion about something and then they just basically give up and just so, oh, like, okay, here, they just basically reveal where they got their opinions from.
Yeah, exactly. I've seen good videos that break down Dark Souls 2 and the problems with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never been surprised. I've never seen one of those videos and been like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. Or, man, you're making a good point. It's just kind of confirming stuff I already get, right? It's Dark Souls 2. We've all played it. If you play it well enough, you know kind of where its flaws lie and its shortcomings. And when you first start up the game, when you first start up any game, right? It's typically blind, right? You don't know what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
When you play Dark Souls for long enough, you already know the mechanics. You know what the stats do. You know what everything is, right? So you take it for granted. It's like all of this is good, right? Dark Souls 2 brought in a bunch of new mechanics that were not explained, that people did not understand, such as soul memory, making multiplayer a nightmare if you didn't know what you were doing. Adaptability, making dodging attacks seem awful. Like, why am I getting hit? What's going on? Does rolling not have iframes? And then it does all of a sudden. You're like, what the heck? And you're like, is it hitboxes? What is it, right? So I get why people are frustrated with it because for a blind approach, It's very jarring if
Mm-hmm.
you play Dark Souls 1 especially, right? Because
Yeah.
it's like, why are we moving backwards in terms of like what's happening? Like I have no idea, right?
Thank you for listening to this podcast clip. If you want to watch more of the podcast, the full podcast is in the link in the description, along with my guest channel name. And if you would like to guest in a future podcast, please contact me and we shall talk so we can discuss many, many topics, more to come. Other than that, have a glorious day.